Hey guys, Mr. Farmer here again. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 6 in AutoCAD. Chapter 6 is basic drawing setup. So our objectives today, number one, we're going to know the basic setup steps for setting up a drawing. Number two, know how to start a drawing using a template. Number three, be able to specify the units for angles and the precision of the drawing. Number four, be able to specify the drawing limits. Number five, know how to specify the snap and grid settings. Number six, understand the basic function of a layout. And number seven, understand the basic principles for setting the print scale and printing from a layout. So lots to cover today. I'll try my best to get through it really quick. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. As discussed previously, when you start something new, you can just click new, right? Or you've got some options here for templates. There's AutoCAD.dwt and AutoCAD ISO.dwt. ISO stands for the International Standards Organization. The only difference between these two things is AutoCAD, ACAD.dwt, is in English units, or what you guys know as inches and pounds. AutoCAD ISO is in millimeters and kilograms. It's metric units, right? International units. So if I select AutoCAD.dwt, it creates a template for me. And if I draw a line and I say 12 and 6, right? This is a 12-inch line and this is a 6-inch line because I've used the AutoCAD template. It's automatically in inches, right? If I get out of here and I start another new drawing and I use AutoCAD ISO, and I draw that same thing and I say it's 12 by 6. You will notice it is very tiny, right? See how tiny that is? I'm going to zoom in on it. That's because this is in metric units. So this is a 12 millimeter by 6 millimeter line segment. Hope that makes sense. So what happens if I just click new and I don't select a template? What do you think is going to happen? Well, it's going to use whatever template was open the last time I was working. So if I just click the word new, and then I start drawing, I'm going to draw a 200 unit circle. Is this 200 inches or is this 200 millimeters? The answer is it's 200 millimeters because I was using the ISO template the last time that I was working. So keep that in mind. It's very important, right? You don't want to create a whole drawing and then find out that you used the wrong units when you set it up initially. So I'm going to start a new one using AutoCAD.dwt. I'm going to be working in inches. And by the way, when you go to startup, if you use that command, there's 3 different variables here, 1, 2, 3. You can play around with those and they change your default settings. So I'll show you what those are. If you use 0 for a setting, it starts the drawing without defined settings. I wouldn't recommend it. 1 displays the startup. Number 2, the start tab is displayed if the available is application, a custom And number 3, the start tab is displayed and the ribbon is preloaded when you open or create a new drawing. That's the setting we use, but just know that you can change these things. Everything in here is editable, I guess is the word, right? So to sum that up, the startup system variable can be used to control the appearance of an older series of dialog boxes for selecting templates or using wizards to set up a drawing. Just a helpful hint there, right? Okay, let's move on here. Let's talk about units. So if I type in units to the command bar here, I can change 2 things. Number 1, I can change the units that I'm using. I can also change the precision of my measurements. What is precision? Well, it's how precise the measurement is, right? So how many decimal places do you want to have? So once again, I just typed in units to the command bar. So for length, the type is decimal. I can also use architectural, engineering, fractional, or scientific. Let's just stay with decimal for right now. Let's not overcomplicate things. If you get into Mr. Dieter's architecture class, you may be using some architectural units, but we're not going to get into that right now. And then I can change my precision. I can go no decimal places, just whole numbers. I can go 2 decimal places. I can go 3, or if I want to be extremely precise, I can have all the decimals. We're going to stick with either 2 or 3 I think that, what was the default? The default for inches is it 4 decimal places? That seems like a lot. Let's go 3. And then I believe, well, let me tell you the right thing here. The default precision for inches is 2 decimal places. And the default precision for metric measurements is also 2 decimal places. So that's your default. We're going to go 3 here. You can also change the precision of your angles, right? So if you want 45.7 degrees, you can add a decimal place here. We're just going to keep that whole numbers. And then once again, like I said, you can change your units. We are in the English units because that's the template we used. So I can use inches, feet, miles. I could use yards. I could use decameters. I don't know. I could use light years. Jeez, astronomical units. It's pretty exciting stuff. So I'm gonna stick with inches, right? And there's lighting. Let's not get into that. So one more time, to get to that, you just type in units in the command bar, and it's right there. Very good. Okay, let's move on. We talked about decimals, we talked about precision, we talked about angles. Okay, couple of helpful hints. When AutoCAD prompts for a point or a distance, you can respond by entering values at the keyboard. The values can be in any format: integer, decimal, fractional, or scientific, regardless of the format of the unit selected. You can type in explicit feet and inch values only if you're in the architectural or engineering units. So let's talk about that real quick, because that might be helpful. I'm going to go to units here. No, I'm not. I'm going to back up. Let's say I wanted to draw a line that represented how tall I am, right? I am 5 feet and 8 inches tall. So usually for feet you would put an apostrophe, and then for inches you would put 2, right? So I would type like 5 feet space 5 feet 8 inches. I'm sure you've seen that before, right? So the apostrophe and then the quote marks. 5 feet 8 inches. If I hit enter, it doesn't like that, right? It won't let me use those units. So what I have to do is go back to units. This is an example of where you would use architectural units. And now I can draw a line that is 5 feet 8 inches tall. So that's kind of helpful, right? That is architectural units. Right, there's my 5 foot 8 inch line right there. I'm not going to use that. I'm just going to go back to basic inches. So decimal, inches, yeah. Okay, perfect. Good. Okay. So let's talk about limits. What is a limit? A limit tells how big your workspace is going to be. So for example, I'm going to draw a picture on a piece of paper. How big is the paper that I'm working with, right? So to do this, we're going to type in limits. I realize I just covered that up with my mouse. Limits. Click. And there's 2 things that it's going to ask you for. It's going to ask for the lower left-hand point, right? And then it's going to ask for the upper right-hand point. And with these 2 points, you tell the system how big your workspace is going to be, kind of like how big your monitor is. So as a good rule of thumb, for your lower left-hand point, let's use 0, tab 0. That puts you right at the origin, which is good. And then it says specify upper right corner. Well, how big do we want it to be? I don't know. Let's make this the size of a regular piece of paper, right? So we'll make it 8.5 wide by 11 tall, right? And I'll show you what that looks like. Let me just delete this line, right? So 8.5 by 11. If I drew a square starting at 0, 0, and then made it 8.5 by 11, there it is. So when I set my limits to 8.5 by 11, that means I'm limited to this area. If I draw a line, it's going to show up. But if I draw a circle outside of this area, when I look at it, when I look at it, it's not necessarily going to show up in that workspace. More on layouts here in just a moment. All right, helpful hint. Before beginning to create an AutoCAD drawing, determine the size of the drawing area needed for the intended geometry. You always want to draw the stuff one-to-one, right? Don't try to scale it on your own. Just draw it the size that it's going to be. After setting units, which we talked about, appropriate limits should be set in order to draw the objects to the real-world size in actual units, 1-to-1 scale. There are no practical maximum or minimum settings for limits. You can make your workspace as big or as small as you would like. If you're planning to plot the drawing to scale, limits should be set to the proportion of the sheet size you plan to plot on. That means if you're going to print this thing out, just set your limits to the size of the paper that you're going to be printing on. Pretty simple stuff. Changing the limits does not automatically change the display. As a general rule, and you just saw me do this a minute ago, as a general rule, you should make a habit of invoking a zoom all command immediately following a change in limits to display the area defined by the new limits. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. Get out of here. So let's say I set my limits to 0, 0, and 10, 10. So it's a 10 by 10 workspace, right? Well, notice there's no units anywhere on this. I'm just looking at a grid. So if I start drawing, if I start drawing just willy-nilly, right? Do I know that I'm in that 10 by 10 limit? Well, probably not, right? So you want to zoom all, and it's going to take you to the size of that limit screen. Hope that makes sense, at least a little bit, right? So let's say limits, let's make it 0, 0, and then 20 by 20, right? Uh-oh. 0, 0, 20, 20. Okay, and then I'm going to zoom all. Okay, now I'm looking at a 20 by 20 workspace, right? Okay, I'm going to hurry so we don't run out of time here. Snap and grid. Snap and grid. So snap just snaps your cursor to a certain spacing. You can make it 1 inch. I'll just make it 1 inch, right? So now my cursor only moves in 1 inch increments, right? So whoop, I can only draw 1 inch at a time. Does that make sense? It snaps to 1 inch increments, which is kind of handy, okay? To toggle snap is F9. F9 you can toggle, or you can just press this button down here, right? There's also grid settings, so you'll notice there's a grid behind the screen. You can specify the spacing of the grid. So I don't know what these little boxes represent right now. It looks like the default value is 1/2 inch. I'll set it to 1 inch. That way it matches my snap settings, right? So now it lines up, right? These little boxes are 1 inch, right? And then the grid is right down here. You can turn it on or off using F7. There's F7 for grid and F9 for snap. There's also polar snap. Polar snap restricts to certain angles. You can restrict yourself to certain angles, and the shortcut for polar snap is F10. F10, polar, right? Okay, that's grid and snap are independent of each other. In other words, each have separate spacing settings, and they can each be on or off on their own. Let's see here. The grid cannot be plotted, so if you print this thing out, the grid is not going to show up. Just keep that in mind. Only your model objects are going to show up. And then a couple of things about printing. So let's, I may go over the 15-minute mark. I apologize. So I'm going to change my limits to, let's see, I don't know, a piece of paper. We'll make it 17 by 20. Okay, and then I'm going to zoom all, like we talked about. And I'm going to draw some stuff. I'm going to draw this little square, this little circle, and maybe a little line that goes through them. Notice I'm in the Model tab. That's where I'm working, Model. If I go to Layout, this shows what's going to print out, or plot, right? Print to plot, we'll get into that later on. So you don't draw in the Layout tab. The Layout tab is just a representation of the model that you've been making, right? This shows what would happen if you printed it on a piece of paper, minus the grid. When you start AutoCAD and begin a drawing, the Model tab is active by default. That's where you do all your work. Objects that represent the subject of the drawing are normally drawn in the Model tab, like we said, also known as the model. Traditionally, dimensions and notes are also created in the model space, so you want to dimension your work there. A layout, on the other hand, represents the sheet of paper that you intend to print or plot your work on, sometimes called the paper space. When you have multiple layouts, layout 1, layout 2, layout 3, each representing a different sheet size and or print or plot, you can have multiple layouts. Therefore, first create the drawing objects in the model space, then activate a layout to look into what it's going to look like if you plot it or print it. So, just to wrap this up, when you scale, see the scale right here? Keep that at 1:1 on your model. You want to keep that at 1:1, and then you can play with the size of the scale on your printed piece of paper later on. I think that's it. I think we covered everything. Yeah, if you have questions, feel free to email me. Thanks, guys. See you soon.